This is a talk on anti-racism, and it is, in a sense, a talk about how to do and how not to do anti-racism, although I don't think my advice is going to be terribly useful to the struggle in its current form. And its arguments are certainly not going to compete for sales with the middlebrow, quasi-political self-help books that clog up the shelves of Waterstones and Barnes & Noble nowadays, like How to Be an Anti-Racist and So You Want to Talk About Race and so forth. And Exhibit A on that front is, of course, that I offer this talk, even though I am, as it so happens, white, extremely white. I nowadays tick the white Irish box on the census forms, but things have moved on a little for us Western Celts since my mother moved to England at the outset of the Troubles. I've suffered, so far as I can tell, no disadvantage directly pertaining to my ethnic background, apart from the minor inconvenience of having to address the matter on an occasion like this. Regrettably, it's impossible to address fully, since a consequence of my argument is that there should be no such incongruity. But since there is, as it so happens, I'm in a bit of a bind. Those who agree with me about at least that will be willing to hear me out, and those who don't will not. But it is the latter, if I'm right, who actually need to hear it. This is, in the end, the central problem about how the question of race is addressed today, and it's merely the most acute expression of a wider phenomenon. On all manner of questions, we refer first of all to the speaker's bona fides before the content of their ideas or arguments. This approach stems from the very reasonable idea that those with unavoidable direct experience of particular forms of inequality have by default more reasonable ideas about that inequality. Those who benefit from such inequities might just as well not even notice they exist. Yet this idea is only a small part of what is routinely claimed, that anyone who is white, say, however much attention they have given in good faith to the questions at issue with racism and however cogent their actual arguments, should give way to an appropriate representative of the oppressed. And exactly what counts as an appropriate representative, of course, is a complicated question, which we'll address later. This idea, I state bluntly, is foolish, but in that case, other questions arise. How could an idea so foolish come to grip sometimes seems an entire culture, sort of the Anglophone West? How is it that Western societies seem to be backsliding on racial justice with the rise of populist anti-immigrants and at least racism-adjacent movements, and simultaneously spreading anti-racist signifiers ever further into the cultural mainstream? How could a political trend whose overriding objective is supposedly diversity have produced such a sterile, ultra-conformist discourse about its basic concerns? And how can the left get some traction on the issue without being sucked along in the slipstream of this discourse, or indeed its opposite of trollish, anti-woke ideology? To talk about an anti-racist consensus is to take as axiomatic that there are two essential definitions of racism. Firstly, the belief or assumption on the part of some human individuals that some groups are superior in intellect or culture to others on account of their ancestry, broadly defined. And secondly, the existence of real disadvantages in society at large for members of particular ethnic groups. At its most abstract, the anti-racist consensus holds that the second definition, that these disadvantages do exist and should not. It mostly holds the first definition of racism too, though that is a slightly more complicated matter nowadays. Check this one place here. The essential ideas of God, I keep losing my place in my notes. The essential ideas of consensus anti-racism can be stated simply. Firstly, racism, as I said, is to be defined primarily in the second sense. There are pervasive disadvantages pertaining to the lives of non-white populations in Western societies. Secondly, these disadvantages are structural and moreover a self-sustaining structure of their own. They are not to be reduced to some more fundamental set of structures. Therefore, thirdly, as the slogan goes, it is not enough to merely not be racist. One must be anti-racist, quote unquote. For any left-winger, this must seem a truism, but since anti-racism in this sense means specifically rejecting the idea that structural racism is reducible to anything else, it is in fact at least a potentially controversial claim on the left. Specifically, it is used to object to arguments for universal provision of social services and civil rights, since these in the end do not address inequality between whites and non-whites, it's argued, merely reset it at a higher baseline. To call anti-racism a consensus is not, of course, to assert that there do not exist racist ideas or that such ideas are not held by many. It is to assert that these ideas are marginalized, at least in America and Britain, to which these comments are addressed. Vast bodies of civil and criminal law exist to deal with racial discrimination. Hate speech is illegal, and so, in principle, is discrimination in employment and in similar matters. Tony Sewell's notorious report on racial disparity in Britain, the one you'll remember that was denounced as a pure piece of gaslighting and an insult to anti-racists everywhere, made sure to herald the great advances that have been won through struggle over the last decades. People today are occasionally sacked on account of racist statements that would have got them lynched in the Old South for being too racially egalitarian. Racist utterances in polite society begin with, "I'm not a racist, but." Yet racism sprouts like buddleia in the cracks in the consensus. It seems that no level of uniformity among the bourgeois elite is ever enough. There is always somehow more racism, however much we huff that it has no place in our society. Indeed, when I say that there is a crisis of this consensus, which is my central argument, I mean that its mechanisms seem to have stopped working completely or even become counterproductive. We need to account for this both in terms of historical sequence and structurally, to use a word. In American history, the key turning point is the Civil War and the subsequent defeat of radical Reconstruction. The large population of Black freedmen in the South were disenfranchised again and reduced largely to semi-serfdom. Strict racial segregation became the norm. Those who escaped to the North faced super exploitation in industry and popular racism from the white workers with whom they competed for work. Many labor unions excluded Black workers. After the First World War, and particularly after the crash of 1929, significant struggles erupted that undermined the grotesque racism of American society. A renewed upsurge in labor militancy caused a shift towards industrial unionism. The new Congress of Industrial Organizations, among other advances over the old craft unions, disavowed segregation and color bars in its membership. Communists began organizing among Black workers in the Deep South, especially Alabama, at extraordinary risk to their own safety. After World War II, these preparatory efforts finally bore fruit, with the civil rights movement that rapidly became unstoppable. It was incorporated into official society. Its more radical edges sanded off. Often this de-radicalization was accompanied by the brutal methods of the secret state, but it also stemmed to some extent simply from defeat of the radicals. Those who had been Maoists in the 1960s and 1970s faced the collapse of the new communist movement after Sino-American rapprochement resulted in an obviously pro-imperialist global policy on the part of Beijing. A sort of anti-racist come anti-imperialist identity politics was one intelligible outworking of that, alongside Dengism, empirism, and other desperate Stalinist attachments. And it was the version of post-Maoist disillusionment most likely to thrive in the USA. In Britain, the story starts out rather differently. We never had substantial domestic slavery, of course. That sort of thing we kept out of sight and out of mind. Speaking to you from one of the great slave ports of the triangle trade, but we didn't have our plantations in Surrey. We had them in Jamaica, in the American colonies, and so on. We did, however, have an empire, and that empire, even after the abolition of slavery in the beginning of the slave trade, rather, in the beginning of the 19th century, still demanded a class of colonial administrators. These were bred in the worst traditions of the English public school, which inculcated little enough knowledge, but plenty of brutalization and pack mentality. These men were, of course, overwhelmingly and hideously racist. Any view that what they were actually up to in the colonies was legitimate would have to be. And by the same token, it was true of imperialist political culture back home. Since successive governments were engaged in rampant exploitation of a quarter of the world, and indeed since there were strongly held political views in society that this was wrong, an apologia was necessary, and had in the end to consist of the virtues of European Christian civilization over the supposed backwardness and savagery of Africa, Asia, and so on. Colonialism created inward migration to Britain, and the post-war era, which saw the eclipse of most of the British Empire, accelerated this considerably. The residual imperial racism of the ruling class fused with the popular racism among backward workers and petty bourgeois against non-white immigrants. Enoch Powell notoriously exploited such sentiments, and in the same year, 1968, that he delivered his Rivers of Blood speech, the Labour government issued a more or less explicitly racist immigration policy designed to stop an influx of ethnically Asian refugees from Kenya. At the same time, the government introduced the first race relations legislation to fight discrimination in employment. The result of this model was the election of a Tory government, the marginalisation of Powell, the growth of the fascist National Front, and a far more vigorous left-wing agitation about racism. The US and UK ended up at similar destinations via different roads. The state at this point began to manage racist sentiment far more assertively. The cycle of liberalisation and backlash on the question became key to politics. The contradiction was extremely clear in the Thatcher years. The government was not shy of dog whistle rhetoric, which rather cut the far right's electoral support off at the knees. At the same time, the infrastructure of modern multiculturalism was built in earnest. It brought social peace after urban rioting by making concessions to oppressed ethnic groups in the form of concessions to middle class and patriarchal community leaders and religious organizations. Thatcher and Reagan destroyed their country's labor movements and set in train a wave of financialization that would cause inequality to sharpen consistently over the subsequent decades. And they did so in the name of social conservatism. But there was a contradiction there. After all, the legitimating aspect of conservative ideology had always been its claim to patrician values and noblesse oblige. A replacement of some kind was necessary, and what was found was equality of opportunity. For the political economic settlement of neoliberalism to appear legitimate, it had to diversify its class elites. Since the numbers of the super rich were tiny and their ranks essentially impermeable, that meant diversifying the professions. It is widely observed that consensus anti-racism, and more broadly the amalgam called wokeness by its enemies, has its base in this layer, often called the professional managerial class, or PMC, though there are reasons to object to this framing. Here we transition from the historical to the structural, and we must necessarily take a detour into the theorization of the professions from the class point of view. There are two sharply opposed accounts of this that are worth considering as a sort of initial step. The first, as we have noted, is the idea of the professional managerial class, first posited by Barbara and John Ehrenreich, who were two American social democratic intellectuals. Their conception covered everyone from political functionaries to creative industries types. Their unifying feature, effectively, is an undergraduate degree. Such people, as argued, naturally rise to the top of small group left politics, but just as naturally prevent such groups actually connecting with the working class whose interests are in the end antagonistic to theirs. In retrospect, Barbara Ehrenreich summarized the problem, talking about her days in the New American movement, which is one of the predecessors of the Democratic Socialists of America today. There was a real difference, she said, between people who worked essentially telling other people what to do, and teachers get included in that, and people who do the work that other people tell them to do. It becomes a difference between manual and mental labor, but it carries with it a shitload of weight. I see it all the time, the contempt for especially white working class people among leftists of college backgrounds. At the far opposite end, analytically, from this conception, is the idea that effectively, there is nothing terrifically special about professionals at all. Alexander Mackay and Leila Meshri, two rather eccentric Marxist academics, put it nicely in a headline of an article in the Bella, which is a sort of anti-woke left publication. It's the petty bourgeoisie, stupid, they say. Whereas the Ehrenreich see the professionals as a sort of new class with a distinct relationship to the means of production. Mackay and Meshri see them as the logical evolution of the classical petty bourgeoisie as capitalism declines and becomes more statized. The problem with the Ehrenreich's account in this variance, as Mike McNair argued in the Weekly Worker not too long ago, is that it produces an amalgam. There are plenty of people who do not directly employ labor and are employed in very favorable terms by capital, but we're not all managers by a long shot. If the managerial aspect is crucial, then the insistence that teachers and managers starts to look pretty strained. Never mind graphic artists, computer programmers, civil engineers, and barristers. All these people get told to do at least as much as they tell others what to do. And the teacher's authority over children does not, like managers proper, get them any real benefit over people in desk jobs with nobody to manage. The idea that it's just the petty bourgeoisie meets its own limit, however, in the necessary incoherence of that class. Marx said of the French peasants that they form a class in the way that potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. The extant smallholders, of course, are technically speaking part of the petty bourgeoisie, along with the urban artisans and self-employed professionals classically named by that phrase. So too, on Mackay Meshri's account, do the modern elite professions. If we're merely engaging in dividing society theoretically into social classes, as it were, counting the potatoes in our different sacks, then there are very compelling reasons to throw the professionals into the petty bourgeoisie. As an account of the consensus ideology, however, there's a real problem here. We find it only dominant among the modern professions. As an example, the rural petty bourgeoisie and the provincial self-employed tended to spring for Brexit, even when it was quite comically against their material interests, so you can sort of see in like fisheries and so on. The urban employed professionals sprung the other way, overwhelmingly on sort of anti-racist kind of political grounds. The Ehrenreichs give us at least a theory that we might apply to this reality. Simply assimilating the professions of the petty bourgeoisie, on the other hand, is question begging. McNair's account is rather that the bourgeoisie and proletariat are the two basic classes, but they are interpenetrated, and that the employed professionals possess limited means of production in the form of skills, which can then be leased to the capitalist for a technical rent. This is part of a wider reality of capitalist society, that control of information in general amounts to a kind of property right. I think it needs to be stressed that this is a very peculiar property right. If we take a classic petty bourgeois, say a furniture maker, she might decide to pack it in and sell her hammer and her workbench on eBay and get a bit of money for it. A computer programmer cannot sell her Python expertise in the same way. She might accept money to teach the skill to someone else, but at the end of the day, she will still have that skill. Information, including skills, is not alienable. It cannot be exchanged, only copied. To realize the value of, such as it is, of intellectual property, it is necessary for the possessors to restrict access, to stop it being copied. The means to ensure this are various. Sometimes wider society will do the existing professionals a favor simply by doing a terrible job of teaching people the skills. This, roughly, is what happened to computer programming in this country between 1990 and 2010, and fixing it was the only good thing Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove ever did. Sometimes institutional means will be found to control access, as the pre-entry cold close shop at the bar restricts the numbers permitted to represent litigants in court. But there are also informal means, the creation of a hidden curriculum beyond the formal requirements of competence and accreditation. In fact, the informal means are the most universal because they double up as a means of ideological legitimation. In Britain, it was formerly common for the upper professional layers to be dominated openly by old boys networks. Promotion meant being a good chap, which boiled down to some extent to grasp of the distinctive slang of the elite schools of this country and immersion in the macho and homeless social culture of that milieu. The underlying ideology was of the natural born-to-rule aristocracy, whose essential nobility supposedly ensured, again, noblesse oblige, alongside a well-bred talent for leadership and clubbable attitude to fellow class members. Such an ideology is in contradiction with the essentially middle-class mores of bourgeois society, but long survived as a vestigial feature of the early modern world that gave the middle class birth. The Thatcher-Reagan era replaced that class culture and ideology with a new one, and in some respects, probably an old one, a different one anyway, which was meritocracy. The public schoolboys were still around, of course, but they learned to stop their glottals and sound roughly normal. The professions were staffed by the people who deserved it by dint of their achievements. In the end, however, the whole thing was still backed by cliquery and opaque networks, most particularly based on elite universities now, rather than schools. This wave crested, it seems, around the time of the Great Crash of 2008. And the transparent injustice of its results took the shine off meritocracy altogether. The world the geniuses built was one of forever wars and credit default swaps. Wokeness, quote unquote, is clearly enough the replacement. In saying so, we do not mean to say that the people who advocate consensus anti-racism, liberal feminism, and what have you are necessarily insincere. And in fact, the contrary is overwhelmingly the case. People believe these things very passionately. It is more a question of evolutionary selection, as opposed to rival liberal or left-wing conceptions of these hot-button issues. The ultra-identity politics has the advantage of being expressed almost entirely through the imposition of speech codes and manners, which is thus functionally identical for the purposes of elite coherence and control of access to Eton slang. But the old idea of natural elitism having been destroyed, it has a far more vital moral center, and thus does a far better job today as a legitimating ideology. Let's return to our earlier description of the content of consensus anti-racism. In order to protect the concept of structural racism from the threatening incursion of rival analytical frameworks, particularly that of Marxist class critique, the focus must be on the apparently universal experiences of people of color as such. That ends up being a very minimal thing indeed, essentially the risk of being beaten up or even murdered by racist thugs. But that turns out not to be so universal in itself. It very much depends on what neighborhood you live in, what kind of risk that you're actually under. So the idea of violence ends up colonizing other misfortunes. Failures of professional workplace decorum placed in the context of the long and indecorous history of empire and slavery and so on become microaggressions, which are sort of homeopathic doses of violence. The result is something like stolen valor, which is the phenomenon of politicians and others fictionalizing a proud military record for mass consumption for their kind of personal gain. The moral urgency of, say, mass incarceration of black males or police murders in America is applied spuriously to stressful Twitter interactions or trivial spats in the university staff room, which supposedly contain the very seeds of the hanging tree. Moreover, it also produces a kind of rhetorical arms race. There is a doctrine in American intellectual property law that says that if you don't defend a trademark or copyright, you effectively lose it. This is even more true of informal intellectual property, which is not backed by the force of law, like speech codes of a clique, or as in this case, a class fraction. To have that property is just to exercise it and extract rent, as it were. If you are not excluding people, and indeed inventing new and exciting ways to exclude people, like novel applications of a patent, you are in danger of being left behind. The tendency, therefore, is for ever more trivial injustices to be absorbed into structural racism, and thus painted in the bolder colors of struggles past. There is a contradiction, however, between the content of the ideas advanced, which are at least in principle egalitarian, and the uses to which these ideas are put to justify the comfortable existence of a sophisticated but soulless upper middle class in the same societies as mass homelessness, structural unemployment, and pauperization. The traditional idea that the poor ye always have with you, and the meritocratic idea that anyone can succeed with enough graft and talent, and therefore those who haven't have only themselves to blame, is replaced with the idea that the towns of Northern England or the American Rust Belt are simply full of resentful bigots who are undeserving because they are not good anti-racists according to the prevailing rubrics. So we find soi-disant crusaders for social justice campaigning to purge the word master from the world's computer code bases 1 minute in case it triggers some ancestral trauma for the descendants of slaves, and the next speaking in comically contemptuous terms of enraged rednecks or gammons as the root of all social evil. Since this is all conducted at the level of manners and jargon, it is moreover extremely shallow in its social reach. The evidence for this is necessarily piecemeal, since each linguistic conjecture of consensus anti-racism must be refuted individually on its own terms. But it's perfectly obvious to run-of-the-mill workers or petty bourgeois or whoever that just because you have a kung fu master, you do not thereby posit the existence of a kung fu slave. An illustrative example comes in fact from the United States. Before the Nixon administration, there did not exist an official racial category on census forms and the like to cover those who hailed from the Spanish-speaking countries of Central and South America. The authorities decided that one was needed and chose Hispanic. At a certain point, academics and organizers committed to identity politics decided that using an English word had a certain unpleasant neo-colonial flavor, and so there was a shift to using Latino instead. But of course, Spanish is a language with gendered nouns, so we need the feminine complement Latina. Yet even having the pair is not enough, since it excludes those who do not fit comfortably into the gender binary. So there was invented the word Latinx. This is now the preferred demonym on NPR and in the communications of right-on NGOs and PR departments. Outside of such settings, we know the word has essentially zero traction. A poll of members of this demographic a few years ago revealed that a grand total of 3% identified as Latinx. A further poll a few weeks ago found that the proportion had risen to 4%. So the arc of history is long and all that. The latter poll revealed an absolute majority of respondents simply didn't care which of these bureaucratic terms were used, so that they asked a follow-up question, which was basically, but if we held a gun to your head, pick one, which is kind of funny. And actually, the older poll discovered that people prefer to identify as Mexican American, Cuban American, like more specific categories that deal with their actual countries of origin and ancestry. But this hardly needs explanation. After all, in the name of inclusivity, consensus anti-racism has chosen the word equally unpronounceable and hideous in both English and Spanish, and no less the confection of a remote and unaccountable professional elite than Hispanic was in the 1970s. Even within the elite, the contradiction manifests itself as a total inability to digest the fact that members of the various marginalized groups demur from this discourse. For all the exhortation to listen to the voices of people of color, there are no voices so effectively suppressed by consensus anti-racism as those of Black people who do not share its assumptions. Far more credence, indeed, is given to the infamous Robin DiAngelo, peddler of struggle sessions to American HR departments, and quite as white as I am, than to a left critic like Adolph Reed, never mind outright right-wingers like Ben Carson, or indeed our old friend Tony Sewell. American liberals seem completely incapable of addressing the fact that Trump's vote among Black and Latinx Americans increased between 2016 and 2020, except naturally by feebly redefining some of the Latinx folks as white after all. As consensus anti-racism comes under assault from both its left in confused and too timid ways, and from its right, it tends to develop a pronounced bunker mentality. It is stripped down in the end to its essentials, and is thereby revealed as essentially a mechanism of elite coherence, of sorting sheep from goats. It validates the privileges of those already in, while the right steals back territory among the elite classes. And it equally gives the right a spurious coherence in that racist and ultra-capitalist elements of the right are once again united. Movement conservatism a la William F. Buckley may be dead, but it has a certain inheritor in sort of anti-woke griping, so exercise of the right nowadays. For the left, indifference to racism is of course quite unacceptable, and this is the problem with outlets like the Bellows and what have you. Leftist gullibility in the face of consensus anti-racism is a product, first of all, of a correct gut reaction against its obvious contrary. But the experientialism of this form of politics is in the end self-undermining. There are many gut reactions, and if we are to act coherently, we must in the end select one as, with apologies to George Lukács, the imputed gut reaction, the one we would all have in our right minds. Instead, we should think more closely about the structures of structural racism. We've described them partially already. An imperialist state must in the end generate racism. We have just had the most extraordinary spectacle of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and no end of worthies urged the Americans back in to finish the job, as if the job was not perpetually fattening the same narco warlords currently cutting favorable deals with the Taliban. The only way America finishing the job can be presented as the best option is if we suppose that the Afghans are so benighted that they cannot even meet that low bar. But there is also popular racism, which in the end is a matter of trying to elevate yourself by punching down. In the former case, racism is the effect of the capitalist state system, and its necessary inequality between nations. In the latter, the need of capital for cheap and pliable labor generates divisions among those who would labor. In both cases, we have structures, but the structures are not primarily about racism, but stance, raison, and sectional advantage, respectively. The consequence of this analysis for leftists is uncomfortable, or ought to be. Let's take an unusually illustrative example, the British Socialist Workers' Party. Many comrades will be aware that almost its entire activity today is under the sign of its front group, Stand Up to Racism. I must confess that, as Ollie said, I'm quite a prolific writer. I feel like I'm always writing about Souter's latest achievements. I've never actually been moved to go to the About page on this website to see what it thinks it's up to. I will now subject you to an extended quotation. On 21st of October 2017, our founding national conference drew together over 1,300 anti-racist activists and was addressed by Diana MP, Tala Ahmad of the Muslim Council of Britain, and Moira Samuels of Justice for Grenfell, and many more. The clear and powerful message from the conference was that when we bring all these struggles together and fight as one, we can be more effective than we could possibly imagine. I cannot resist also quoting the last but one sentence of this text. We will be back next year for another huge demonstration against all forms of racism. The most recent date mentioned in the whole text is 2018, suggesting that Souter hasn't given the page much more attention than I have, but also how weirdly indifferent to results Souter is. 3 years after those words presumably were written, we have swapped Theresa May, the tedious daughter of the Rectory, for Boris Johnson, he of smiling pickaninnies and ill-timed Kipling quotations. This does not seem more effective than we could possibly imagine, though perhaps I just have an overactive imagination. The appeal to unity, in any case, is an appeal to another gut feeling, and one especially well-founded for those committed, as the SWP claims to be, to the revolutionary communist tradition of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, and Luxemburg. And for that tradition, unity matters at a fundamental level. The revolutionary potential of the proletariat and Marxist theory is a thoroughly negative affair. In a world run according to property, here is a class with no or merely trivial property. So its only power is in its sheer mass, and as a consequence, its ability to intelligently direct that mass. But of course, having solved the problem of its self-liberation, the working class has solved the problem of liberation for all, since it has by definition severed the link between intelligent direction and exploitative property relations. But suppose we set out not for the maximal unity of the working class, but of the anti-racist movement such as it is. In fact, we set out to unite people whose interests are opposed to each other. Unity can only be achieved by suppressing those divergences in the interests of coming back together for another huge demonstration next year. But racism, as we have argued, is an effect of capitalist exploitation and its corollary of imperialism. Unity of the anti-racist movement means unity, for example, with Zionists who issue fake anti-racist calumnies against the Palestinian movement, for example. And indeed, Souter has disinvited BDS supporters from speaking at rallies in order to keep, I think it was Scottish Labour Friends of Israel, I can't remember, on board with its big anti-racism days of action. It also means unity with whatever magnificent troll came up with the woke CIA recruitment advert, which is possibly the funniest thing ever recorded. You should watch it if you haven't. But it sort of consists of a sort of Latinx CIA analyst or something, just regurgitating meaningless garbage about her generalized anxiety disorder for about 5 minutes. Those who want more diversity in the boardroom are by definition the enemies of those who want to abolish the boardroom, as all communists surely do. To treat them otherwise is by definition to turn yourself into a fighter for the legitimating ideology of the liberal wing of the capitalist elite. It therefore prevents us from offering a way out of the liberal conservative alternation of hegemony in capitalist states, which after all is our job, and an alternative pole of attraction not only to the overwhelming majority of people of colour in Britain and the States who are working class, but also elements of the professional classes who are sincere in their moral convictions. Our gut reaction turns out to be wrong. We don't want to unite the whole of the anti-racist movement if that means just uniting all who are prepared to mouth anti-racist platitudes. So far as such unity exists, in fact, our role is to destroy it, break it apart. We should be wreckers. Of course, we do so in the name of unity, a real unity of interest and political solidarity against the phony unity of cultural slate of hand. Our efforts must be judged by results and for real, not by miscounted numbers on a protest march against this sort of thing. In the end, for all its stupidities, its censoriousness, and its aesthetic nullity, the basic problem of consensus anti-racism is both more boring and more fundamental. It places right in front of its eyes a problem that it cannot even correctly characterize, let alone solve. Really abolishing racism would mean breaking the link between historic disadvantage and present thriving. But that demands not the replacement of one elite ideology with another, but the end of elites altogether. And that's all I've got.